Member for Gwoja.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I do stand alongside thousands of voices across the Northern Territory and the nation today and for the next 16 days and for the rest of the year and for the rest of the time, as long as it takes to overcome domestic, family and sexual violence. Madam Speaker, uniting on this issue is incredibly important, and to demand urgent action against the devastating epidemic that is domestic, family and sexual violence that ravages throughout Australian communities. Madam Speaker, it is important to acknowledge that the Northern Territory coroner yesterday handed down her findings into the 4 deaths of Aboriginal women in the Northern Territory, women who should be with their families and their communities. The coroner made 35 recommendations aimed at making women and children safe. And Madam Speaker, I am proud to come out and say that Territory Labor supports every single one of those recommendations and will work to ensure that they are fully implemented, if not now, then when a future Territory Labor government is returned. Madam Speaker, yesterday, one of the most prominent and profound comments that came from the Northern Territory coroner was, "No further delay can be tolerated." Madam Speaker, that is right. It's time for change, and it's time that we, particularly as men, stand up and be counted. Counted about calling out violence against women and children, because it has to stop. Territory men have an opportunity to be leaders, to be strong, to support Territory women. Now is the time to do it, Madam Speaker. We cannot just march and protest. We need to take action at every chance. We need to have hard conversations in clubhouses, ceremonies, family gatherings and barbecues, because the standard we walk past is the standard we accept, and we cannot accept this behaviour. Family violence is not just a statistic, Madam Speaker. They are people. They are loved. They have families. They had goals. They had aspirations. They had bright futures. Domestic and family violence is a plague that inflicts immeasurable damage, heartache and trauma, especially within Aboriginal communities here in the Northern Territory. It is an affront to our humanity, shattering families and fracturing the very fabric of our society. The burden of this violence disproportionately weighs upon women, children and family units. Madam Speaker, I am alarmed that the government have said that they are going to do an audit. They are auditing an audit. The ICRO, as it's commonly known, did just that. They mapped the domestic and family violence sector. They mapped the desires of the sector. The Interagency Coordination Reform Office came together with industry experts, with victim survivors, to share their lived experience and to understand what needed to be done. We don't need to do the mapping exercise. It has been done. That is the role of the ICRO. That was the role of the commitment of $180 million, the start of the process of investing in the ICRO. I spoke, Madam Speaker, to a number of people in the domestic and family violence sector yesterday who were really overcome with emotion because they had closure for the 4 women who died. But they were also disappointed in the responses that they got. And talking to them last night, they said, "We don't need more auditing, more mapping. We did that work. We just need the goddamn money." Because money is not going to change everything, but it is going to make a huge difference in beginning the journey to overcome the horrific rates of domestic and family violence here in the Northern Territory. I want to make it really clear, Madam Speaker, the Territory's organisations in the domestic, family and sexual violence space do an incredible job. And while some people may be critical and say they need an audit, we need to check their KPIs, we need to hold them to account, what we need to do is fund them appropriately. That's what we need to do. And I acknowledge that every form of government ours included, needs to step up and fund them better, because that's how we drive that change, Madam Speaker. Auditing the framework is playing with politics. It's not helping vulnerable women and children, because the ICRO was the audit. It was the service mapping exercise. We need to put the money into being able to fully deliver and implement the ICRO. So I stand with the sector today in saying we don't need another audit, we need the investment. Madam Speaker, Aboriginal people, like all Australians, deserve the right to live safe and with dignity. We are entitled to exist free from the shadow of family violence and abuse. This is not merely a cultural expectation, it is a fundamental human right. Yet the alarming truth is that Aboriginal sisters and brothers are often denied the same public outrage, the same empathy and the same sense of justice that others receive when faced with similar horrors. As an Aboriginal man, Madam Speaker, I am immensely proud of my culture, my connections and my stories. But I want to be clear. I'm not proud of the narrative that depicts our First Nations people as victims of domestic and family violence. Why? Because the staggering levels of violence against Aboriginal and children are nothing short of disgraceful. We are the custodians of ancient lands, the keepers of sacred songlines and stories, and the guardians of rich cultural assets. Today, I stand alongside the thousands of voices across this nation, uniting to demand urgent action against the devastating epidemic of domestic and family violence that ravages our communities. Madam Speaker, like I've said before, as an Aboriginal man, I'm proud of my culture, but I want to make it clear, domestic and family violence has no role in our culture. I want to acknowledge that yes, there are parts to the untrained eye that elements of our cultural practices may be seen as harsh, such as processes in ceremonies or sorry business, the deceased of a loved one, or our other sacred obligations. But those practices are reverend and must be honoured. They are not violent practices out of spite, jealousy or self-gratification. Domestic and family violence is not a part of Aboriginal culture. I want to make that incredibly clear today, Madam Speaker. As we work to overcome this, government officials and community members must cast aside their fears and report suspected incidences of violence and abuse. We must dismantle, Madam Speaker, the shameful code of silence that has allowed violence to persist. I want to, Madam Speaker, take a moment in particular to talk about a number of things. The more we invest in domestic and family violence for the initial period, the higher the statistics will be. The more we provide funding and resourcing and reform, for the interim period we will see an increase in domestic and family violence. And it can't entirely be attributed to people becoming more violent or being violent. It can be attributed to vulnerable people, our women, our children, our communities, feeling comfortable and safe to come forward and to report domestic, family and sexual violence. We can expect, with an increase in funding, the need for crisis shelters, the demand to increase, because people will feel supported and encouraged to leave violent and toxic relationships because the support systems are in place. We can expect, Madam Speaker, for people to talk more about domestic and family violence when there is an increase in funding and an increase in resources, because people will feel empowered to take the carriage of their destiny back from a perpetrator and to free themselves from a life of violence. Madam Speaker, we all have a role to play in this parliament, to have those tough conversations, to not only just share Facebook posts and go to protests and rallies, which is an important sign of support. But we must all come together and call out the bad behaviour, to work together, to empower our community members to have the courage and to be fearless to come forward and report domestic, family and sexual violence, Madam Speaker. I was heartened, Madam Speaker, during the federal election campaign when the now government came out and talked about an increase in funding. The Territory doesn't want or doesn't need a one-off funding increase. The Territory needs needs-based funding now. And the offer still stands as it did in the first sitting of this Assembly to go to Canberra to advocate for needs-based funding now, because that is how we will overcome the horrific rates of domestic, family and sexual violence, Madam Speaker, is through that important investment, because that is how we will change lives. I want to also, Madam Speaker, acknowledge the amazing work of people and organisations who have been long-term advocates in this space, whether they have been the women's shelters, the crisis accommodation centres, the women's legal services, the advocacy groups, the people inside the Department of Territory Families, Housing and Communities, the people running the sexual health and the reporting abuse hotline areas. They have all played an incredible role in shaping what the Territory needs to do through that ICRO bid, Madam Speaker. I want to also acknowledge the coroner handed down 35 recommendations. Those 35 recommendations alongside the ICRO's work is the pathway to overcoming domestic, family and sexual violence. It's work that has not been largely driven by politicians. It is work that has been driven by experts, by victim survivors, by evidence-based approaches. That's the best way to overcome this, Madam Speaker. We've heard in this chamber before talking about initiatives. They're important initiatives, like the Specialist Domestic and Family Violence Court in Alice Springs, a really important initiative. We've heard about wonderful programs like Boys Can, Girls Can, normalising and educating people in schools around the roles in which girls and boys can play in our community, and that you are not less than any of a person if you perform roles that would be stereotypically aligned to a particular gender. This is important stuff, Madam Speaker. This is the work that needs to continue now and into the future, because that is how we change. I want to also acknowledge the number of safe houses, Madam Speaker, across the Northern Territory, particularly in the remote regions across the Territory. We've got a number of safe houses right across the Territory. And I want to also acknowledge last Friday at the Alice Springs Police Station, the Tungunjura Women's Family Safety Group unveiled their mosaic. And whilst it is an absolutely beautiful artistic creation, it serves as an important moment in our time to memorialise, commemorate and honour the women who have lost their lives in the Northern Territory. It serves as a permanent installation, a safe space for women and families to go in difficult times. It's quite ironic that such a beautiful thing is in between such a difficult space, being the judicial precinct where the Supreme Court, the local court and the police station is. This beautiful reminder of the women who we have lost too soon. Madam Speaker, these statistics are absolutely horrendous. We've heard time and time again how bad they are. We have lost 8 beautiful people since June this year. We're not even halfway through the year. We have families who at important times no longer have the love of that person. We have families who every day have to live with the heartache of missing a loved one. And we continue to come in here and we continue to talk. And talking is important, don't get me wrong. It's really important to talk and to raise awareness about this. But talking alone is not going to bring back the 8 women who have lost their lives this year alone. We're not even halfway through the second half of the year and we've lost 8 Territorians already. We've had Aboriginal women being killed on the esplanade in front of the federal government minister at the time, and yet we still talk. The time for talk is over. We do owe it to every Territorian, man, woman and child, to work together, to go to Canberra and advocate for needs-based funding, to reform the laws that need to be reformed to protect vulnerable people. We've done that work. We've started that work. Is it over? Definitely not. Will it ever be over? Definitely not, because we can always strive to do better. We started that work with the contemporisation of the domestic, family and sexual violence, featuring coercive control, because we've heard that it is a major problem, but we've worked with the sector around the best way to target that and overcome it. And Madam Speaker, I think while we are talking, we all have to set a challenge for ourselves, and that's every single person in this parliament. It's every single person in an important position of influence. Language matters. If we want to overcome this horrific epidemic that we are faced with, then we need to be mindful of our own language. We need to stop saying that we're fighting or we're arguing or we're attacking. We need to remove that type of language from the conversation, because we are perpetuating the use of that language and we are normalising the use of that language. And language matters. It really does. I still extend my offer, as I did last sittings, to the government or to any member of this parliament who wants to come together and lobby Canberra for that additional resourcing and that additional support, because that's what is needed. And I want to just reflect in my final minutes, Madam Speaker, to acknowledge the incredible resilience, strength and compassion of the amazing women who gave evidence at the inquest. I want to acknowledge, the amazing Shirlene Campbell from Alice Springs. I want to acknowledge Dr. Shay Brown, Larissa Ellis, Marie Corbo, the representations from Darwin at those coronial inquests, because that was not easy. Those amazing women relived their own trauma in giving that evidence. Some victim survivors reliving the trauma. Organisations reliving the trauma when they were giving testimony to that inquest about just how awful that was. So I want to say thank you to those amazing women and organisations who had the courage and who were fearless to attend the inquest to be strong. I stand with you now, as I will stand with you every day, in thanking you and in working incredibly hard to make a difference. Because that's the very thing. This chamber, the 25 of us working together, can make the difference. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Are there any more speakers on the ministerial statement? The clerk will read the order of the day. Oh no. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, domestic violence in the Territory is a national shame that demands our collective action. Yesterday's findings from the coronial inquest of over 17 months' worth of hearing into the tragic deaths of Miss Yudapingu, Nayu Raguk, Kaman Rapabanji and Kumanjay Haywood made it absolutely clear that more needs to be done to prevent domestic and family violence in the Territory, and it needs to be done now. Madam Speaker, Territory Labor has pledged to work with the Chief Minister and the CLP Government to secure needs-based funding, recognising that this critical issue transcends any of our party politics. We must adopt a bipartisan approach to address the scourge of domestic and family violence across the Northern Territory. The statistics are indeed alarming, and since 2000, at least close to 90 women in the Territory have lost their lives to domestic violence, including 11 women in the past few months alone. Madam Speaker, countless more have been hospitalised and many have suffered in silence, their experiences often going unreported. This is not just a social issue, it's a whole of community issue that affects people from all walks of life and cultural backgrounds. Disproportionately, however, Madam Speaker, Aboriginal Territorians and Aboriginal women and children bear the brunt of this violence, which is often linked to poverty, disadvantage, overcrowding, substance abuse and other socio-economic challenges across our community. We must acknowledge the devastating impact of domestic violence on our communities and work together in this Parliament to create safer and more supportive environments for all Territorians that we represent. This requires a sustained commitment to addressing the root causes of violence, providing adequate support services and promoting a culture of respect and empathy across the Territory. Madam Speaker, the numbers are stark. 90% of women who have lost their lives to domestic violence in the Territory are Aboriginal women, Madam Speaker. Almost half of the women in the Territory have experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15 years old, with 1 in 3 women experiencing violence, emotional or economic abuse by a live-in partner. Putting these figures into a broader context, Madam Speaker, partner homicide in the Northern Territory is 7 times the national average. 7 times, Madam Speaker. Endemic and a scourge and a crisis. Many labels have been put on this tragic situation that we are experiencing across the Northern Territory, and unfortunately they are all fitting descriptions. It is, without a doubt, one of the most urgent issues facing the Northern Territory today, and one that I ask the Parliament to unite on, Madam Speaker. I was alarmed, Madam Speaker, in hearing the member for Port Darwin's words of saying that they need to take a step back. What for, Madam Speaker? We need to take steps forwards, and we need to take these steps forwards together. Yesterday, the federal government responded to the Senate inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations women and children. This was a report chaired by the federal Liberal member that delivered bipartisan recommendations. This was a report that we saw the federal government look at. And when we're talking about the findings of the report, we need to ensure that the findings of any inquiry guide a government, federal or territory, Madam Speaker, when it comes to a response that is proactive around the safety to reduce domestic, family and sexual violence across Australia. And indeed, the inaugural National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Family Safety Plan, which will be launched in 2025. Madam Speaker, they saw that Parliament and the community is calling on the federal government and the federal Parliament to do more, and they have decided to act quickly and decisively and together. The former Territory Labor government committed to investing an additional $180 million into addressing domestic and family violence before the Territory election. The CLP government has honoured the same commitment, but not a single cent has been put into the domestic violence prevention sector, who are crying out for this additional support, Madam Speaker. We are calling on the CLP government to stop delaying and to urgently respond to the domestic and family violence crisis across the Northern Territory. You are in government and we will support you in your efforts. Getting additional money out of our frontline services, which is where it will make a difference, Madam Speaker. We've listened to the Chief Minister's response, and unfortunately, on this very issue, she has been more interested in playing politics with the issue than getting the money out the door to the service providers who so desperately need it, Madam Speaker. The Chief Minister and the Treasurer are happy to get the money out the door for the homeowners grant scheme, but they have not spent a single cent, Madam Speaker, in making sure...
Take your seat, Leader of the Opposition. What's your point of order?
Thank you. Standing Order 20, I ask that the Deputy Chief Minister stop interjecting while the Opposition Leader is speaking. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you. Please refrain. Unfortunately, it's midday, which means it's time to suspend for lunch. We are now suspended until 2 p.m. The following committees are meeting during the lunch suspension: the Privileges Committee at 12 in the Ormiston Room, Standing Orders Committee at 12:15 in the Ormiston Room, and the Standing Committee on the ICAC at 12:30 in the Litchfield Room. See you at 2 p.m. Well, members, I advise of the presence in the gallery of the member for Johnston's mother and her partner. We will now resume the debate on the motion to note the Ministerial Report on Domestic and Family Violence in the Northern Territory. Member for Arnhem, you have 4 minutes and 34 seconds remaining on your contribution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as before the break concluded, I was speaking my contribution to this very important report. Madam Speaker, we would like to say to the CLP government, as the Labor opposition, that we do agree that the federal government needs to do more to support the Northern Territory, regardless of politics. Again, whether it's a Liberal federal government, whether it's a Labor federal government, we need to ensure that we are unified and working together to address domestic violence needs, to ensure we have the best possible impact in a positive way for the Northern Territory. Let's not be petty in politics and get in the way of releasing the much-needed funding that the domestic, family and sexual violence prevention sector have been calling for. Madam Speaker, the Labor opposition want to ensure that there is early prevention, intervention, rehabilitation measures that support the DV sector. The experts who work in the family, domestic and sexual violence sector are calling for this and have been for many years. And we know, Madam Speaker, unfortunately, by the stats, which of course the CLP have said that they don't respect and can be used in any way you want, but we do know that half of the men in the Northern Territory who are in prison are there at the result of domestic violence offences, Madam Speaker. This is a distressing statistic of the domestic violence story across the Northern Territory, but we believe, Madam Speaker, it is one that we can turn around if we work together. Madam Speaker, violence against women is preventable, but again, only if we work together. Our former Labor government laid the foundation for a strong and sustainable response in regards to domestic and family and sexual violence prevention in the Northern Territory, and we will continue to support that work even though we are now in opposition. Madam Speaker, it will not be fixed in 8 years. It will not be fixed in the next 4 years. It may not be fixed in the next 10. But we can agree to work together to ensure that the CLP government, as well as a bipartisan approach here in this chamber, will work together and follow that strong path that has been laid out, the blueprint has been laid out, Madam Speaker, by the experts in the field, the sector. Our Labor opposition strongly urges the CLP government to fast-track the rollout of the $180 million investment, which was first committed to by Labor but also taken up by the CLP, who are now in government, to ensure that these commitments are delivered on, Madam Speaker, putting their money where their mouth is. On behalf of Territorians, Madam Speaker, especially those who are on the frontline services at the coalface and dealing with the impact, the horrific trauma that is experienced daily by Territorians when it comes to family, domestic and sexual violence. Madam Speaker, our Labor opposition puts our hands on our heart when we say we will do everything we can to support the rollout that the CLP government has promised Territorians, but we urge the CLP government to do this urgently and quickly with the DVS sector as the lead, Madam Speaker. Again, we offer our bipartisan support. We know that this place here is bigger than all of us as individuals, and it fully represents the 25 electorates that we get the honour and privilege to represent in the Legislative Assembly, to ensure that we have that full perspective across the territory. Madam Speaker, the former Labor government advocated for 8 years around fully based, needs-based funding for the DV sector, and we didn't get there. We got there for remote housing, we got there for tertiary education, we didn't get there for health, and we didn't get there for DVS. We passed that baton on to the CLP government because we know that we will only get the change and the funding that we need in the territory if we continue to advocate and work together in this very important non-political space, Madam Speaker. So we will continue to advocate in that, Madam Speaker, and we commit to supporting the CLP government in that bipartisan approach. Madam Speaker, our parliament must have the will to move forward together, not stand back to look, to talk. We need to see the action that is demanded from the communities that we represent in this place. We need to ensure that the solid framework for all of us to work together to address family, domestic and sexual violence in the Northern Territory. There is no further delay, and we get that money out the door to where it's desperately needed. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Nightcliff.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am a survivor of men's violence. I prefer to use the term men's violence or intimate partner violence instead of domestic violence because I believe our society, whether deliberately or not, diminishes the seriousness of this violence when we put the word domestic in front of it. I spoke publicly for the first time this year about being a survivor. I was incredibly nervous to do so, and it still makes me a bit uncomfortable. But I do it because it is important that our voices are heard and our faces are seen. 1 in 4 women are survivors of physical or sexual violence. With that statistic, whether you know it or not, there are survivors in your life, which also means you most likely know a male perpetrator. But I know that victims and survivors in the Territory are overwhelmingly Aboriginal women. They face many more barriers than me in getting help and seeking justice. This violence is a scourge in our community. We are failing generations and generations of Aboriginal women and children. Let's be real. This scourge of family violence goes hand in hand with poverty, with homelessness, with disadvantage, with the effects of colonisation and with racism. I also know, as a survivor, that victim survivors are sick of the talkfest, sick of politicking, absolutely sick of it. So I don't have much else to say today because everything that has been said has already been said many, many, many times. Just put the money where it's needed. Do it. The work has been done. The sector knows exactly what it needs. We just need to listen to them and give them every dollar they need. I was distressed to hear the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence call for more consultations. No more consultations. No more audits. We're not reinventing the wheel. The sector knows what it needs. It's been telling government for decades. So please, I beg this Assembly, can we rise above the party bickering and party politicking? Let's move forward. Let's get the $180 million on the ground now. And it should be said that if you can roll out money for first home buyers before it's legislated, there's no excuse to not start funding DV now. And let's go to Canberra and secure needs-based funding. Thank you.
Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to begin by making some comments that have been passed to me by the member for Mulka, who's currently with family due to a death in his family last night. Mr Gwoja would like to make it clear that family violence is not part of Yolngu Aboriginal culture. The following is his statement that I will read out. Sometimes people say that Aboriginal culture is violent because they hear historical stories about spears in the leg or a history of fighting between clans. It is true our traditional culture has had punishment that involves a spear in the thigh as part of a lawful response. Our traditional culture has had the death penalty for those who committed significant crimes. This has come through the lawful process of makarata, a form of restorative justice which still exists today without spearing in the leg or killing, Today, we use compensation and banishment to other communities and other means to make matters right. Western culture still has capital punishment today in some countries and has historically had very barbaric forms of punishment. Our culture has had leaders who have acted unlawfully or people who may have been violent towards their kin, but this has not been lawful violence. This has been a crime. And it is no different to powerful leaders of other cultures who have behaved badly. King Henry VIII of England was a leader who cut off his wives' heads. Traditionally, we have had kin relationships that provide protection where needed. The Maori relationship provides protection to the Gutara, that is, the grandmother clan that provides protection. And the relationship that a child has with their mother's mother is a very special one. So today, when we see such violence around us, when we see women are being killed and harmed unlawfully, we know that something has gone terribly wrong. But I also know that our people do have the solutions to these problems. The families involved in this coronial inquiry have suffered the loss of a loved family member, and for some families they have suffered knowing that their kin has taken a life and gone to prison. This cannot continue to happen. For these 4 women and many more, their communities must also be part of the inquiry. They must be asked what they need to ensure that this does not happen again. This is the closing the gap space. I welcome the coroner's recommendations for community-led mediation and peacekeeping work. This is what I have been calling for over 8 years. And I will tell you that it needs to go further because we need to address the underlying issues. Our traditional ceremonies are about the teaching of rapery. This is respect for country, respect for kin. This is our Yolngu education system through which we teach young people about respectful relationships. But due to the colonisation and assimilation that has come with missionaries and governments, we no longer have the space to provide these important cultural teachings. Assimilation has pushed much of our teachings out of the way. Our kids fall through the gaps because they are forced into Western education systems that don't always make sense or have meaning for them, and because of this they often don't attend. And this push for Western education without a genuine commitment to 2 ways bilingual and bicultural education has meant that some of our cultural teachings and ceremonies have fallen away. But this is what is needed now to teach our young men about their responsibility not to cause harm and teach our young people about respectful relationships. We see young people having relationships at a very young age when they don't yet have the education and learning to act with leadership and responsibility. This is why we need our young men out on culture with male elders learning to serve their families, and we need our young women out on country with their female elders learning to serve their families too. As a Yolngu leader, I have learnt my role is to serve, it's not to be served. I am responsible for looking after the people of my clan and associated clans. This is also the teaching that our young people need. It is the Yolngu values and culture that we are seeing disappear that is throwing people into chaos. And so I appreciate the findings of the coronial inquiry, but I am aware that it is the jurisdiction of a Ballender court, and it is important that the leaders and elders of our community are given the same space and respect to tell you what our recommendations are, so that we can work in partnership with all those services and government departments that are working towards ending the tragedy of domestic and family violence we see everywhere. It is time for this government to act, and act in partnership with the services and people who have the knowledge and answers. Closing the gap is about sharing decision-making with First Nations people, and this must happen if we're going to see long-term change for the people in the Northern Territory. I thank the Minister for bringing her statement today, and I hope that we will see swift government action. These are the words of Mr Gwoja. And I'll now read my statement. Madam Speaker, I heard the Minister say today that it is absolutely vital that we do not rush a response and that there's been no evaluation of the work that's been done. This could not be further from the truth. What is actually vital is acting now to keep women and children safe. We've heard numerous times today that the domestic, family and sexual violence sector desperately needs the funding it was promised immediately. In the words of the coroner, given the recent loss of life and the extent of the horror, no further delay can be tolerated. The time for action on domestic, sexual and family violence was yesterday. We don't need more audits and evaluations. Action Plan 1 has already been fully evaluated. It's available for anyone to see online, and I'm hopeful that the Minister and everyone in this chamber has familiarised themselves with it. Action Plan 2 is specifically tasked with monitoring, evaluation and accountability. It's already in place. If people haven't seen it, I have a copy here. I think the Minister cherry-picked from this report from point 6 today when she said evaluation was not taking place. There's a clear framework to measure and monitor outcomes and undertake evaluation. I cannot overemphasise the level of work that has gone into evaluating the sector to improve the safety of women in the Territory. We do not need more review, we need action. It's good to hear the Minister expressing her support for funding frontline services for men's behaviour change programs, for early intervention programs and support programs, which are all key components of the action plan and the framework, the plan that the Minister is criticising. All of this work was developed in consultation with the very same frontline workers the Minister says she wants to listen to. Why hasn't the Minister listened to what they've already told her, what they've already said? This framework, the one that already exists and is the product of multiple reviews and years of work by experts, is the framework that the coroner has described as sound, sensible and supports. We do not need to throw out this plan that was developed over years with frontline workers, experts and governments. We need to act on it. And I echo my fellow members in saying that removing the alcohol floor price will only exacerbate this crisis. There's a clear link between accessibility to alcohol and women being harmed and killed. The work has been done, Minister. You have what you need to make a difference. I hear how passionately you are committed to making women and children safe. We have what we need. We do not have time to do that all over again while women are dying. To quote the coroner, if the task seems too big or overwhelming and this all sounds impossible, if anyone is feeling defeated, there is some good news. With all this combined input, we know what needs to be done and there is no reason for any further delay before action is taken. I call on the CLP again to urgently commit to the funding it's promised the sector so that we can walk out of this chamber today having made women and children safer. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Arafura.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today in the chamber to add my voice to the ministerial statement and join my colleagues in this chamber in saying enough is enough. Today we face a crisis that has shattered too many lives and stolen the future from far too many families. The Northern Territory had the highest rates of domestic, family and sexual violence in Australia, and that is a stain on us all. We are in a domestic violence crisis, and like any crisis, it demands a response. The statistics are damning. Since 2000, over 90 women in the Northern Territory have been killed by domestic violence. That's 90 mothers, daughters, sisters and friends who will never come home. 8 of these women lost their lives since June this year. Nearly every day we see news headlines with more stories about violence. Another sister, daughter, mother gone. As an Aboriginal man, it is sad what is happening, to see what is happening in our families, and especially in my own community and in my own families. In the Territory, women and children experience a higher rate of domestic family sexual violence, with 9 out of 10 victims in the Northern Territory being Aboriginal women. For me, that's my sisters, my mothers and my aunts. Too often it happens. Madam Speaker, women in remote and regional communities are more likely to be hospitalised for domestic violence and also encounter greater barriers to reporting violence due to shame, stigma and lack of services and support. The vast majority of these, again, are Aboriginal. These violence perpetrated by close families members and intimate partners inflicts trauma that follows survivors through their lives. It impacts every part of their being and tragically it also affects their kids. Madam Speaker, the link between violence in homes and youth issues in our streets is undeniable. Children who grow up in fear carry that trauma in every part of their lives and the cycle of violence continues. There is a straight line between kids who are on the streets and getting in trouble and this violence. The well-being and development of kids are not possible when they are not safe at home. You want to know a powerful way to stop young people from ending up in front of a judge? Stop the violence from home, which then in turns gets them into the mischief that they get into. We have seen the devastating findings of coroner Elizabeth Armitage. Findings that expose cracks in our systems. The time for talk is over. We need a bipartisan approach with leaders across this chamber standing united to fight this crisis. Reducing domestic and family and sexual violence requires a united front and action from all parts of our society, particularly the Territory's leaders like us. I reiterate what my colleagues have said. Labor stands with the government in calling for needs-based funding. We need more money for prevention, early intervention, and a crisis response. We must ensure that remote communities don't fall through the gap and miss out on the services they need to ensure that families, women, and children can live in safe environments. The Leader of the Opposition has said she will stand shoulder to shoulder with the Chief Minister to call on the Commonwealth for this funding. Territorians expect this from us. And the $180 million in funding, the government needs to get on with allocating. Those working in the sector are crying out for it. I join them in pleading with the government to fast-track and roll out this funding as soon as possible. It will save lives. Madam Speaker, I want to acknowledge and thank those frontline workers and advocates operating in domestic and family and sexual violence sector right around the Territory. Countless organisations, legal services, and safe houses. They deserve our praise. They do so much positive work in the face of what seems to be an impossible crisis. I want to also acknowledge the strong Aboriginal women who are standing up to this every day, sometimes risking their own lives to help their sisters, aunts, and mothers. I tell them that we are here to support them and will do everything in our power to ensure they receive the support that they need. So, colleagues, it's time for leadership. Every headline about another woman lost is violence to violence should haunt us. These are not just statistics, they're human lives, torn from their families and communities. Let us act with urgency and compassion. Let us honour the courage of those who speak out in the memory of those who we have lost. Together, let us commit to building a territory where no woman or child has to live in fear. Thank you.
Are there any more speakers on the ministerial statement? Member for Daly.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it was only last month in this Assembly that we spoke about how domestic, family and sexual violence is a scourge which is continuing to have a terrible and ongoing impact on women, family and communities across the Northern Territory. Yesterday, the coroner handed down her coroner report into the deaths of 4 women. These women were all victims of extreme domestic violence by their intimate partners. A shocking and horrifying occurrence, an occurrence which we cannot stand any moment longer. This extensive report highlights how important it is that we have this conversation on the issues and that we do so with the seriousness it deserves, and that we do something about it. The statistics are and continue to be incredibly distressing. Madam Speaker, 87 women have been killed by their domestic partners in the Northern Territory since the year 2000, of whom at least 82 were Aboriginal. Each of these women is remembered by her family and loved ones, and community continues to feel their loss. We have and continue to see and hear horrific stories over recent weeks, nationally and here in the Northern Territory. Yesterday, the federal government also tabled its response to the Senate inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations women and children. The findings and recommendations of this inquiry were horrific. Nationally, First Nations women are 7 times more likely to be homicide victims than non-Indigenous women. and of those women, 75% are killed by a current or former partner. First Nations women are 33 times more likely to be hospitalised due to family and domestic violence than non-Indigenous women. But domestic, family and sexual violence isn't only about Aboriginal women. It is a serious, prevalent and life-threatening problem that crosses all ages, culturally, ethnic and social economic backgrounds in this country. This is a national shame, Madam Speaker. This is our national shame. We see on the faces of families the heartache which is felt when they lose their loved ones at the hands of someone they knew intimately. It must stop. We are part of our tight-knit communities in the Northern Territory, and we cannot go far without knowing someone who has, or at least has had, a family member experience domestic violence. We must stand up and say enough. We as men must stand up and say this is enough. It is a blight on our society and has no place in our cities, regional centres or remote communities. No women and children deserve to feel unsafe in their own home. Madam Speaker, addressing the appalling rates of family violence experienced by women and children requires a concerted effort involving all governments, both territory and federally. It must also include our Aboriginal and community control organisations, our multicultural communities, sporting groups, faith-based communities, and individuals all need to step up in this. Domestic, family and sexual violence should not be and cannot be a discussion relegated to the sidelines. Not now, it should always be front and centre. Madam Speaker, domestic, family and sexual violence is claiming the lives of too many Northern Territory women. It is tearing our families and communities apart, and I cannot say it enough. It must stop. While we know that this problem is complex and challenging, we cannot shy away from it. Domestic, family and sexual violence is preventable, and with a concerted collaborative effort, we can give every Territorian the fundamental right of living a life where they are safe, respected and free from violence. This is why we cannot leave this effort to just the words that are spoken here in the Assembly. Again, we need action. We need the men's behavioural change programs. I know that they are effective. In order to prevent domestic, family and social violence, we need to ensure that there is the ability to stop it before it starts, or to make people understand that it is not acceptable. We need the government to fast-track and roll out its commitment of the $180 million to fully fund the second stage of the Domestic Violence Action Plan. We need to put money into prevention, into early intervention and crisis response. We need to ensure remote communities don't fall through the gap and miss out on the services that they need to ensure that families, women and children can live in safe environments. Madam Speaker, I want to acknowledge and thank the magnificent work of the frontline service workers and advocates operating in the domestic, family and sexual violence sector. There are a number of organisations, legal services, safe houses across the Territory which deserve our praise. They do so much positive work in the face of what continues to look like an inscrutable crisis. We are here to support you, and that we will do everything in our power as an Assembly to make sure you receive the support that is needed. We will face this crisis head on. We will work for the women and children of our communities. Thank you, Madam Speaker.